What's the mood right there? This is day one of another pretty long haul and a pretty distressing time for people.
Yeah, I think people are obviously very distressed at the figures that we've been seeing. I think no one likes these lockdowns, and especially no one likes going back into lockdown after having previously enjoyed a degree of freedom of movement. But certainly from people I've been talking to, and indeed from the Greens' perspective, the government's got our support on this. This is about protecting lives. This is about making sure that we contain any further outbreaks as much as possible within the Victorian and, of course, the broader Australian community. So I think for a lot of people, it's obviously it's different if you're in the public housing towers where there's a great deal of distress, and we've got some criticisms about how that has been operationalised. But broadly, these latest lockdown announcements, I think everyone, no one really likes it, but people are accepting of it.
So on the public housing, I mean, there appeared to be some early hiccups around provision of food. It all had to happen quite quickly. You've got some specific needs around language, dietary requirements as well. Was it just the way it was rolled out and maybe lessons for next time rather than the fact that they did say these are a risk, we need people not to be leaving?
Yeah, look, we're not going to second guess the health rationale behind the decision. We don't have access to that information. And again, as I said, we support a health-led response. But the problem is they sent in the police without thinking about any of the other supports that were needed. And so the towers were locked down and people had no idea about how to get food, how to get medicines, how to get access to medical help. And it took the government a few days to work out answers to those questions. And we're still having late night phone calls trying to get food into those towers, trying to get people the support they need. And if you're sending in the police and saying you can't get out, then you should also be sending in the nurses, sending in someone who has the capacity to run the whole scene as if it was a fire scene, for example, who is able to then treat it like an emergency and make sure everyone gets looked after. And it's as if they hadn't even thought about that, and that's caused a huge amount of distress to people in the towers.
The prospect raised today from Stephen Duckett, he's a former Department Secretary, the Health Department, federal one. He says perhaps we need to consider eradication, that this lesson in Victoria, this was what we're always told, there'll be other emergencies and waves, but this shows that you have to go and lock down, that maybe you go through harder pain and then you come out of it with eradication. What do you think of that?
I think it's a discussion we've got to have because there's been a big push to from the federal government, from others saying, look, we have to reopen, we've got to get things moving again. And I think if you look across the ditch to New Zealand, where they stayed the course, and you wonder what might have been in Australia. And I think this push for everything to reopen, while of course in some respects it's understandable, we're seeing potentially in Victoria what happens if you don't have a health first response. And when New Zealand, where they're in a position to say, look, we have they pursued what some would call an eradication strategy, and they're close to success on that. I think we see here in Australia still some states maintaining very, very hard borders themselves where they're able to do so. I think we've got to ask questions about whether this idea of we have to get things moving again, we have to start reopening again, was the right call.
Delving into a few other the causes of where we're at right now in Melbourne, there's been obviously criticism of what happened with the Black Lives Matter protest. The New South Wales government, for example, made every effort to try to stop it going ahead. Of course, it did happen in the end, but the criticism has been, at least the message was sent to people then, the health situation is still volatile, don't head out there. In Victoria, there was no court challenge and it was allowed to go ahead. Did that send the wrong message?
No, I don't think so, because the people who attended the important rallies, certainly the ones that I spoke to, were socially distancing. People took precautions, and I think in the wash-up of it all, as we're now facing the further outbreaks, I don't think anyone is suggesting that somehow the protests and the gatherings that happened were a source of further spread or further infections. It's coming through other areas. And I think, again, I know some people have made that comment, but if you want to make that, then be consistent. They also shouldn't have been out there saying, sending that message from the rooftop saying, we've all got to get back to life. These restrictions are too strong. Now we're seeing what happens if you start to advocate and say, no, the restrictions aren't right. They've all got to be lifted. Everyone's got to get back to normal. It potentially plays a role in where we're at now.
Is it fair enough, though, to say right now, if there were another call for some sort of mass protest, that would be too much? That couldn't go ahead, given the escalated crisis right now in Melbourne?
Well, I don't think there's anyone calling for that at the moment. So I guess we'd cross that bridge if and when we come to it. But in the towers that we see at the moment, there certainly are people who are feeling like they've been treated like second-class citizens and do feel like there's been some different standards that have been applied. And I think we do have to have a full look at what has gone on inside the towers and the way that the response, because I worry that there was a bit of potentially a bit of an overreaction in a sense that we have to come in force first without thinking about the other things. And I think there's going to be a lot of lessons that will be learnt from that. I think that's the big thing to focus on at the moment.
But just on right now, I mean, you never know when another protest movement will have a call to arms for action. Right now, do you concede that the level of crisis in Melbourne would mean that you'd say, no, that we can't really do this right now?
Well, the protesters are trying to draw attention to something very, very important, which is that there's been a very high rate of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody in Australia, and that it's not just things happening in the United States, that it's happening here at home as well. And our message has been very consistent, that if Scott Morrison doesn't want to see people attending these protests and he suggests that it's a health risk, then he could take steps to stop it from happening. So if we're talking about just hypothetical calls, might people call for a protest, Scott Morrison could do something about it now.
But are you saying if there were a call right now for a protest this weekend, you'd say, yep, fair enough, that's a good cause, it should go ahead?
Well, I make the point that no one's making the call, and if we want to talk about practically things that could be done to minimise people making such a call, Scott Morrison could put Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody on the National Cabinet agenda, make states change their laws so that we stop locking up young Aboriginal people especially, and that would go a long way to relieving these calls from coming in the first place.
It does seem like it's being escalated on a separate matter, but I do want to ask you a final aspect of this, obviously to do with the hotel quarantine. The handling of this when asked questions by the Premier Daniel Andrews, we can't even find out for now which minister oversaw the involvement or made the call of involvement of private security firms. Is that not good enough in terms of transparency?
No, I don't think that is good enough, and I think the inquiry that I think is taking place in Victoria will hopefully shed some light on that, and I'm glad that there is that inquiry taking place. Look, again, it's a bit like the situation with the housing towers at the moment. It just wasn't clear who was in charge. It's not clear who's been making these decisions. And yes, let's have a health first response. And yes, let's treat it like an emergency, because it is. But when you're dealing with an emergency, you've got to have a system of command and control and an emergency way of responding to it. And we're very worried that that is in fact falling down in instances where it's needed. And again, I don't raise this as sort of a party political point. Like, the Premier and the government's got our full support. We want to see this contained, because this is a health threat to all of us. It's not about who you vote for, but people need to know that when there's an emergency, that there's going to be the capability of an emergency response, and not just a call for it publicly, but it's actually going to be enacted on the ground. And there's been a couple of instances where that doesn't seem to have happened, and that is concerning.
So I'm just trying to probe the transparency issue, because you said you support the inquiry. This is a separate inquiry. It won't look into politicians per se and their role. There's also the issue of Labor MPs on a separate parliamentary inquiry blocking right now any prospect of them being able to probe this issue separately. Is that just not good enough right now? We need answers out of this?
We do need answers, and we do need to know who's in charge and who's making the decisions, what decisions they made, and whether they were executed properly. I make the point again that in situations of emergency, you need to know that there's clear lines of command and control, because otherwise things don't get done in the way they should. And to not be able to find out even who is in charge.
Here's the direct question.
I'm agreeing with you that I think that
I understand that
we need to know.
So to go really directly, the next time Daniel Andrews is asked about this and he mentions inquiry, he should tell us who made the call to have private security firms in charge and for the lack of police and ADF oversight.
Look, I think everyone needs to, there needs to be transparency. We need to know what the role of ministers were, who made what decision. So that definitely, I think the public is entitled to know that, just as they're entitled to know that with respect to the housing towers. I think that transparency is important. Right now in Victoria, I think we're all wanting to make sure that the emergency response is as effective as it can be so that we stop the spread of this virus.
But clearly it looks like the big error here for Victoria, from what we know, if you compare them to other states, is yes, there have been private security guards used, but the lack of oversight from both ADF and police, that seems like a glaring error that has a lot of people in Melbourne angry right now. Would you agree?
Well, I think even I'm critical of the way that that decision was handled, but even the Premier has admitted that there's got to be some questions answered here, and I hope that those questions, that there isn't any shoving of blame off to someone who's not responsible, but that we also find out who made the decisions at the top, because I think we're entitled to know who made the decisions at the top, because this situation may be going on for some months, if not even longer, and to be sure that we have the confidence about the decisions that are being made, I think we do need a bit of transparency in the decision-making structure.
There's a push by the Liberal Party for the Public Accounts Committee to be able to look into this in the Victorian Parliament. Would you support that?
Look, I defer to my Victorian parliamentary colleagues on that. My recollection is that the Greens did support moves for there to be an inquiry, but I defer to my Victorian colleagues on what the appropriate way to conduct that is. You might invite them on, and I think that they'd have quite a few things to say about the response here in Victoria.